Hello, this is Senator Bob Menendez, New Jersey's United States Senior Senator and Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's an honor to be included today at Hudson County Community College's annual Holocaust and Armenian Genocide commemoration. It has been several generations since the horrors of the Holocaust and the Armenian Genocide. But we must never forget these systematic attempts to eradicate and erase entire people from the face of the earth. With every panel discussion that examines these crimes, we combat Holocaust and genocide denialism. And I want to thank you for your continuing commitment to education on these issues. At a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise at home and around the world, we have to guard against acts of intolerance and hatred. At a time when we commemorate the 107th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, we have to teach future generations about the violence that can be unleashed when hatred goes unchecked. Appropriately identifying and continuing to promote education about these historic examples is critical as the world continues to confront modern-day atrocities against ethnic minorities, like the Rohingya or the Uyghurs. Finally, we must honor the memories of the 6 million Jews and 1.5 million Armenians who lost their lives. And we must pledge to speak up when we see anti-Semitism, hatred, and bigotry in all its forms. This is how we create a world of tolerance and compassion. This is how we turn our solemn promise to never forget into a vow, never again. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Dr. Ara Karakashian, one of the Associate Deans at Hudson County Community College, but more importantly, a descendant of Armenian Genocide survivors. I would like to welcome you to our annual commemoration of the Holocaust and Armenian Genocide, whose aim is to prevent anti-Semitism and genocide denial through creating a world of tolerance, compassion, and education. I would like to first thank all our panelists and moderator for sharing their knowledge and time for today's event, as they are joining from Yerevan, Armenia, Amsterdam, Netherlands, Worcester, Massachusetts, and Jersey City, New Jersey. I would also like to thank the following for organizing and supporting this commemoration: Dr. Christopher Reber, Yuris Pujols, Elana Winslow, Michelle Vitale, Rafi Manjikian, Ani Chaglassian, Karina Shinorokian, Willie Shirer, and the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education. I would also like to thank our sister institutions of higher education and secondary education in the state of New Jersey for logging into today's commemoration. If you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and we will pose them to our panel. I would now like to invite President of Hudson County Community College, Dr. Christopher Reber, for his remarks.
Thank you so much, Ara. Good morning, everyone. Ara, Alana, and Yuris, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today and for leading and organizing this exceedingly important educational program in Remembrance. And on behalf of the Hudson County Community College family, I thank all who have contributed to the planning and offering of this annual commemoration. I extend my welcome to our students, faculty, staff, and community members who are here today. I also join others in welcoming and thanking Dr. Boyle Stevrick, Dr. Jermaine Mcalpin, and Dr. Henry Theriot for their willingness to speak and participate in today's panel. Today, we look back and remember the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust, two historical events resulting from the failures of peoples, leaders, and nations to live up to their potential for good and their failures to exhibit the best of humanity rather than the worst of humanity. Some might want to dismiss these events as relics of our past and deem them unrelated to our present. But so many more, unfortunately, recent events, such as, to recognize just one of many, the Rwandan genocide of 1994, where over 500,000 people lost their lives. These events remind us that our future is fluid, unpredictable, and vulnerable. Our own nation is polarized in ways not seen in generations. Nationalism has been rising, and a powerful country just invaded its sovereign neighbor, resulting in the death and devastation of millions of innocent people, an act reminiscent of the 1930s and 1940s. We can and must learn new things and new ways for respecting basic human rights, civility, dignity, and shared goals of peace to pass on to future generations. Our advances in systems, technology, and research speak volumes of our potential to learn. As citizens of the world, we all have a moral responsibility to learn from our errors in order to create a better future. In 1905, George Santayana said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." In the end, good must always triumph over evil. We share a responsibility to educate, bring awareness, and encourage reflection and dialogue as we do today. So again, thank you all very much for joining us. Really appreciate this very important program and the fact that this is now going to be an annual commemoration. Thank you all.
Thank you, President Reber, for your remarks. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Sarah Cohan, Education Director of the Genocide Education Project, who will introduce our panelists. Thank you.
We're still muted.
You're muted.
You're muted, Sarah.
First step, right? Unmute. So good morning, I'm Sarah Cohan, and like Ara said, I'm the Education Director of the Genocide Education Project. I'm moderating this session from Yerevan, where I have been attending a conference on genocide education at the Armenian Genocide Museum and Institute. For you today, tonight, I am so fortunate to be a moderator for this incredible group of scholars. I'm going to just give you a brief biography of each individual here tonight. Henry Theriot is the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Worcester State University. After teaching in its philosophy department from 1998 till 2017, he has spoken and published widely on mass violence against women and girls and genocide perpetration, denial, victim-perpetrator relations, reparations, and prevention. He was the lead author of Resolution with Justice, the report of Armenian Genocide Reparations Study Group, 2015. With Samuel Totten, he co-authored the United Nations Genocide Convention, an introduction that was published by University of Toronto Press in 2019. Theriot has served as the International Association of Genocide Scholars President between 2017 and 2021, and is the founding co-editor of Genocide Studies International. He earned a BA in English from Princeton University and his PhD in philosophy from the University of Massachusetts, with specializations in social and political as well as continental philosophy. Next, we have Jermaine Mcalpin, who has been an academic and thought leader with an in-depth knowledge of African philosophy, Caribbean philosophy, transitional justice, genocides, and political science. His expertise has resulted in a collaboration with several organizations and institutions locally and internationally. Dr. Mcalpin has traveled to South Africa, Cambodia, Armenia, and across the United States and Canada, researching and presenting on the Armenian Genocide, the transatlantic trade, and the Africans and in Africa and reparations, truth commissions, and issues of justice. His work with civil society, government organizations, and associations have garnered appearances on several media platforms across the United States, Canada, the Americas, and Jamaica. He has written several articles, book chapters, and edited volumes on truth commissions, reparations, and genocides. Dr. Mcalpin earned his PhD and his master's in political science from Brown University. He is currently an assistant professor and chair of African and African American Studies at New Jersey City University. Finally, we have Doyle Stevrick. Doyle's research is broadly concerned with the civic mission of schools and the role of schools in creating and sustaining tolerant, democratic societies in a globally integrated world. This research focus has multiple strands, beginning with citizenship, global citizenship education, democratic approaches to leadership and policy, and forms of internationalization, including the international labor market for teachers. During the mid to late 1990s, Doyle was pursuing a doctorate in Greek and Latin literature and spending his summers excavating ancient sites in the Mediterranean, spurred in part by the impact of studying abroad in Greece, when encounters with racist extremism drove him to explore the power of education to undermine prejudice and foster pro-social dispositions. These experiences led him in the field of Holocaust education, the focus of his last 3 books, and its contribution to global citizenship education and preventing violent extremism. Since 2013, he has worked extensively with the Anne Frank House. Through that partnership, the College of Education tours 2 exhibits about the life and times of Anne Frank in South Carolina schools. In recent years, he has been invited to present at special events for UNESCO, the International Bureau of Education, and OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Costa Rica, India, Serbia, Switzerland, Ottawa, and Paris. Doyle is currently the executive director of the Anne Frank Center at the University of South Carolina, where he is also an associate professor for the Department of Educational Leadership and Policies. He earned a PhD in history, philosophy, and education policy studies, and a master's in classical studies, both from Indiana University. So tonight we're going to start with looking at definitions of genocide, and we'll hear from Jermaine Mcalpin. So Jermaine, where does the word genocide come from?
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, and good morning, everyone, and to Sarah, good evening and almost good night. Really, what we want to talk about is the importance of understanding not just the etymology of the term, but the inspiration for the term genocide, which is an affixing of Latin and Greek to create a very unique word to describe maybe what was happening long before the word was created, but coin something to express the realities of what these kinds of wanton but very systematic killing of human beings are called. And so I want to just simply provide us with a frame just quickly for a few minutes as to how we came to understand the word genocide, but to also start my small presentation with Yom HaShoah, because today is the continuation of the Holocaust commemoration and remembrance, and April 24th was the Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. So this conversation is very appropriately chronologically timed at this juncture of these 2 genocides that are sometimes not properly linked, and that's what I quickly want to do. So just bear with me as I share my screen, and I will then turn back over to Sarah. And as always, these things have a way of freezing. Let me start again. Here we go. All right. If you are seeing my screen, you can let me know that you are.
We are.
Okay. All right, great. So, you know, we were asked to talk about denial, and I'll leave much of that to the question and answer engagement. But I wanted to start with this idea of how we come to understand genocides. So let me just quickly go through these slides. All right, now it's advancing. So what is a genocide? before I do that, that was very odd. Let me start again. It has closed my screen. So let me continue by saying what the PowerPoint was to say. Thankfully, I have the preparation to do so. So when we talk about genocides, we're talking about essentially this idea of the wanton systematic killing of peoples. Now, the UN Convention on Genocide established post the definition by Raphael Lemkin. Raphael Lemkin was a Polish Jewish lawyer who in 1944 coined the term genocide from the two words Greek genos, meaning people, or loosely race. And race was not phenotype, race was just simply a distinct group of people. So genus. And from the Latin side or cada, which means killing off. And so when he merged genus and cada, we get genocide, which simply meant the intent to destroy in whole or in part a clearly identified group of people. When the Genocide Convention was established in 1948, it widened and expanded the idea that it can be the intent to do so. So in other words, if you kill all the women in a distinct group, you would have committed genocide because there is no opportunity for reproduction of that distinct cultural group. We can think of genocides in terms of cultures, religions. We can think of genocides in the way of what I would call linguistic groups as well. We can talk about linguistic genocide. In the case of Canada, we talk about cultural genocides. And so where have genocides been committed? Though the term was coined in 1944, the reality is that it describes historical occurrences and trauma that have occurred centuries prior. We think of the Ma'afa, or the what we call the transatlantic trade in Africans, as acts of genocide. We think of the decimation, extermination, and destruction, and also cultural assimilation of the First Peoples, also called Native Americans, here in the United States as genocide. And so most of the genocides that we talk about really happen in the long 19th century. That is from the late 1700s all the way to the present, with some of the more recent genocides being the Rohingya people in Myanmar and the Yazidis, and also the genocide in Darfur, Sudan, that is a continuation. The PowerPoint is up. I'll just quickly share, if you'll bear with me. And then I'll turn back over because I wanted you to see the slide. But it's now not allowing me to share. That's all right. So when we talk about genocides, we're talking about these killings. In the 20th century, we've had genocide starting from 1905 to 1908 with the Herero Namakwa people in Namibia, genocide committed by the Germans in colonial Southwest Africa. The second genocide of the 20th century would be the Armenian Genocide from 1915 to 1923. But it was the Armenian Genocide that Raphael Lemkin was thinking about and thinking through when he coined the term genocide to describe the atrocities and the horror of the Holocaust committed in the form of pogroms from 1933 through to 1945. And so we've had a history of genocides that stretch back to over 350 years. What it is, we have not learned from this idea. Greg Stanton, founder of Genocide Watch and one of the preeminent scholars concerning classification, comes up with a taxonomy of 10 stages of genocide. And I think it's important that we understand that genocides are not wanton, random killing. They are deliberate and they are systematic, right? And so when we talk about killings and genocides, this is what I want us to understand. I think my screen is back on. Um, if you are seeing,
Yes.
okay. All right. So this is Stanton's classification. I don't want to extend it. I don't want to lose it again. This is Stanton's classification of genocide. In 2012, he added 2 additional to the taxonomy. It used to be 8 stages of genocide, but he added persecution and extermination. So you have to classify people. You have to symbolize them. You have to stigmatize them. You discriminate against them. You dehumanize them. So they are Inyensis in the case of Rwanda, or they're property, or they're to be exterminated. They are not humans. There's an organization of genocide. Then there's a polarization, us versus them. There's a preparation, and there's a calculation. And then we have the persecution. Then we have the extermination. And Stanton argues that denial is the last stage. My perspective is that denial is the continuing stage of genocide, because denial is essentially the continuation of genocide. And that's what we will be talking about on the panel. So quickly, this is just a graph. Where have genocides occurred? You see the transatlantic trade in Africans, First People genocides, Indian reservations, schools, Herero Namakwa, the Armenian Genocide, the Holodomor famine in Ukraine, 1932 to 33, the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust across Eastern Europe, 1933 to 1945, and more contemporaneously, these have been genocides in the last 40 to 50 years. I'll stop here, and apologies for the PowerPoint not working, but we can leave the rest for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jermaine. That was really insightful, and I look forward to hearing more in terms of the denial, your thoughts on denial later. Next, we're going to go to Doyle. Doyle, what was the Holocaust? Who were the victims? Who were the perpetrators? Generally speaking, what were the causes of the Holocaust?
Thank you. So the Holocaust was the systematic effort by the Nazis and their collaborators to murder every Jewish man, woman, and child in Europe and in any territories that they controlled. The Jews in Europe had faced a long history of discrimination. There were many religious myths about them, and I appreciated in particular the emphasis on denial from Jermaine. And I find that especially powerful when thinking about the Holocaust, because the whole history of the genocide was filled with lies. Dating back before the Nazis even existed, there was a long history of lies about Jews and what they were responsible for in history. This was typically religious anti-Semitism. And that history of religious anti-Semitism included Jews being expelled from many territories. So the number of Jews who lived in Western Europe had actually gotten rather small, while in the Russian Empire, an area called the Pale of Settlement, and into Poland, that's where the majority of Jews in Europe lived. So by the time the Nazis come along, the majority of Jews in Europe are in Central and Eastern Europe. Germany, although the Nazis were so singularly focused on the Jews, had fewer than 1% of Jews at the time the Nazis came to power. That's surprising for a lot of people. Poland by itself, with more than 3 million Jewish people, had more Jews in Poland than all of Western Europe put together. And the genocidal history of violence against Jews was so extreme before the Nazis even existed that 150,000 Jews were murdered in that region in pogroms. And pogroms is a Russian word for a reason. These were systematic attacks on Jewish communities that would kill as many as 1,600 people at a time. Now, when the Nazis come on the scene, they don't come out of nowhere, right? They're not coming out of a vacuum. They're coming out of a world where Europe was dominated by empires. If you look at the late 19th century, you had the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire. And the logic of empires was to dominate people, dominate territory, no matter who lived there. So these empires were relatively diverse internally. And that logic of empire applied not just within Europe, but around the world. And so the German Empire included Namibia, where the Germans signed an order to murder every man, woman, and child from the Nama and Herero. And that period that Jermaine mentioned from 1904 to 1908 has echoes that continue through history. There were people put on cattle cars. People were sent to concentration camps. And the racist ideology that suffused the colonial empire was picked up by the Nazis. So the Nazis added a racial ideology to the historic anti-Semitism of the region. And one way to think about it is racism was a new weapon in the anti-Semitic arsenal of the Germans. So when these forces came into play, the Nazis murdered 6 million Jewish people. And the way these racial ideologies work, the Jews were the focus of Nazi hatred, but many other people were considered inferior. And so many other groups had members murdered, Roma and Sinti in particular, but many other groups experienced persecution as well as murders. The other groups were not the focus of an eliminationist campaign like the Nazis conducted. They murdered many others. They had intentions to murder and displace Slavs, but they attempted to kill every Jewish man, woman, and child. And that's, I think, what's crucial to understand is the basic focus of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Doyle, we understand that you entered the field because of exposure to racist extremists. How did these experiences shape your understanding of the issues we face today?
That's correct. So I loved working in other cultures. I worked around the Mediterranean and archaeology. But when I was teaching Latin at Indiana University in 1999, this is the semester that Columbine hit. It turned out that one of my students who failed the class had fallen in with a white supremacist group, and his views never came to the surface in my course. I wish they had, so I had a chance to try to engage them. But he decided that his only path forward was to try to start a race war. So he attacked a synagogue in Chicago, shot 6 men and boys on the way to services. He murdered Ricky Birdsong, the black basketball coach of Northwestern University, while he was with his kids. And then he murdered Won Jun Yoon, a Korean exchange student at Indiana University. And it was all the classical hatreds wrapped together. It was anti-Semitism, it was racism, it was xenophobia. And in case I thought this was an anomaly, within 9 months, my neighbor in Pittsburgh did the same thing, murdered a Jewish neighbor, attacked a synagogue, murdered a black man in a karate dojo, and then attacked Asian immigrants in a grocery store and restaurant. And these hatreds occurred together for a reason. It's not new to collect these hatreds together. This combination of racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism dates back to the Nazis, and the Nazis grouped these categories together with the term Untermensch, literally under man or subhuman. And what I've only learned since I got into this field is that that term underman was picked up directly from the KKK. This was a book published by the Ku Klux Klan that the Nazis adopted that term and borrowed. And unfortunately, these racial ideologies influenced one another across the Atlantic world. So it's not a separate history distinct on the other side of the world, but one that's interconnected. Rabbi Sachs, Jonathan Sachs of London, expressed it very powerfully when he said, "Hatred always starts with the Jews, but it doesn't end there." Indeed, these hatreds are all bound up together, and we find that often considering them together allows us to make progress against all of them. And that's how I ended up coming into the field.
That's really tragic, tragic way of entering the field. Though oftentimes there's not a positive way, is there, to enter in this field, as so many of us are descendants of survivors. So why, Doyle, why do you think that the Holocaust is so difficult for people to comprehend?
It really is hard to understand how a society convinces itself that it should and must murder millions of people, that in fact it sees that as a good thing. How does a society convince itself that it should murder 1.5 million children, and then people feel like they're doing the right thing when they do that? These are very difficult things to understand about societies. Good must triumph over evil, and what's so hard for us to make sense of, for example, in the region where I live in South Carolina, how did slave owners manage to convince themselves that they were good people? You know, that's a very difficult thing to wrap your mind around. The Holocaust is difficult to understand for those reasons, for the long history of lies and denial that surround it, and also for American students as a result of some of the cultural lenses that Americans have. So, for example, Americans are used to a two-party system, so it can be hard for them to understand how the Nazis dominated German politics when they never got more than 37% of the vote in a free election. 2/3 of people were voting for other parties or against the Nazis. So that's a cultural assumption that comes to it. A second common assumption that's brought to the table from our Christian students is Christian conceptions of religion, and they need to learn to understand Jewish identity from a Jewish point of view. And while Christian identity is rooted in faith as the determining factor, that's not how Jews define themselves or understand themselves. So understanding people from their own point of view is a crucial one. And Americans, Christian students often assume, well, why didn't the Jews convert, or could they have converted to save themselves? Well, that's a natural assumption to make from a Christian perspective, but the Nazis were not using a religious conception of Jewish identity. They were imposing a racial conception of Jewish identity. So it didn't matter. You had cases where 4 Jewish grandparents had children that converted to Christianity. The grandchildren were born and raised and baptized, practicing, believing Christians. And those children were gassed at Auschwitz because the Nazis' racial definition meant it didn't matter if they converted. They were still regarded as a race. And of course, race is a biological fiction, but a social reality. So part of our challenge is learning, how do we talk about race in ways that capture its social reality while rejecting the idea that it's got any biological basis.
Very well put. Very well put, especially the idea that while we know that race is not a scientific reality, but it is unfortunately a social reality. You observed that Anne Frank's father, Otto, was born just a few weeks after Adolf Hitler. What can we learn from this coincidence?
So this is very interesting. Adolf Hitler and Otto Frank were exactly the same age, and that's the coincidence, but a paradox gives us a lens into identity. And if we take the Holocaust as an extreme example of identity-based violence, what do we need to understand about identity to make sense of it? Well, the paradox is that both Adolf Hitler and Otto Frank would make this statement. They would each say, I'm German, but the other guy isn't. Now, for us, German seems like a pretty self-evident identity. We think we understand what we mean when we say it. And some of the associations we have are someone born in Germany, someone with German citizenship, somebody who speaks German, somebody's part of German culture. All of those things were true of Otto Frank, who was also Jewish. And Otto would have said about Hitler, well, he was born outside Vienna in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so he's not German. Hitler, on the other hand, his perspective was, well, I feel German, I speak German, and I'm Aryan. In other words, the same word is being used, but a very different meaning is underneath it. Hitler was using German identity as a racial category. And from Hitler's perspective, Otto Frank, because he was Jewish, could not also be German. So, from this racial theory, which is of course false, it was either or. You were either German or Jewish. But of course, from a cultural perspective, Otto was both Jewish and German. And that's what we need to learn to do, move beyond a biological vision of race and learn how to think about culture. And when we do approach things from a cultural lens, it gives us better tools to understand one another.
Now, I understand that something special happened at a recent Anne Frank exhibition that might interest our audience. Would you please tell us about that?
I'd be delighted. So, what we do is run traveling exhibitions around the country. And what we hope students learn is not to have a history lesson, but what Otto Frank insisted, we need to learn the lessons of history. And to do that, you don't need an old guy like me preaching to students. You need to help students learn to talk to one another about difficult issues. So we were in Los Angeles conducting a peer guide training of students so they become the guides for our traveling exhibitions, talking to each other about its contents and what it means. And it was 2 days after Russia invaded Ukraine. And our speaker was a Ukrainian Holocaust survivor that day. And that promoted conversations about Ukraine and what was happening in Ukraine. And the group of people who were there came to understand that the Anne Frank House has been active all over the world in 89 countries. And that involves working with some 200 teachers across Ukraine. And this became a network that the people in Los Angeles, who are also connected to Hollywood, were able to bring different networks together. And the actor of Jewish Ukrainian descent, Liev Schreiber, who will play Otto Frank in the new Disney series, became part of this network. He went to Lviv and met Ukrainians there, worked to serve, drawing attention to the nonprofits on the ground that are doing amazing work. Was recently featured on Anderson Cooper and on the BBC. And through these efforts has already raised more than $200,000 to support people in need on the ground in Ukraine. And the method they're using is very clever because it takes a vetting process, documenting people we know are reliable and trustworthy, operating with networks of teachers and other people standing up on the ground to make a difference, and putting money immediately into the hands of people who needed to make a difference. And that all came together because of the long work of the Anne Frank House and this exhibition we held in LA. So that was really exciting to see how this work commemorating history can lead to positive change in the present.
That's really an incredible story and gives some sense of hope, which is oftentimes something that's hard to find. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and ask Henry a few questions. Henry, what was the Armenian Genocide? And in that description, what events led to the genocide? Who were the perpetrators? Who were the victims? And what types of ethnic groups were included in this genocide?
No, thanks, Sarah, for the question. It's very good place to start. And again, as with other cases, if people are interested in more detail, we can definitely provide some references and so forth. But the basic idea is that Armenians had been a part of the set of peoples in the Ottoman Empire. We just heard about empires from Dr. Stevrick, and understanding that the Ottoman Empire was another European and Asian empire that had existed through military conquest for hundreds of years and had designed a kind of internal structure that you might think of as very similar to an apartheid system that at times was a little bit more flexible than an apartheid system. But there was a strict classification of groups of people that determined what rights they had, right down to whether they could testify in court or bring, if they were victims of violence, could they do anything about it? Were they able to serve in certain jobs or not? Political jobs, military jobs, and so forth were the important jobs. Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, and Jews were in the secondary category because they were not Muslims, and the Ottoman Empire was a Muslim empire dominated by Turkish Muslims. Those groups did not have full rights. However, they did have some rights, generally based on community structures where they were able to sort of run some of their own community affairs. But in interactions with Muslims, particularly around violence, economics, and other things, they did not really have any significant rights at all. And so you can think of them as sort of a secondary caste within the Ottoman Empire. There are other people, these were people of the book, in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, they were at least recognized as having some connection to Islam, and so they had some status within the empire. There are other peoples that were even sort of at a lower level. These were also very, particularly the Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians were a very significant percentage of the Ottoman population and very prominent in many ways, despite all of the handicap that they faced in terms of political rights, judicial rights, and other access to power. They still were prominent, they were known, and so forth. And in many cases, because they were so oppressed within Ottoman society, groups of them moved to other places. Greeks obviously had connections to the country of Greece that had actually become independent from the Ottoman Empire in the early 1800s. And Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, they were studying in Europe. They were through the 19th century, really trying to change their status, but also trying to find a way to live in a more reasonable way with some civil rights and so forth. And so over the course of the 19th century, these groups started pushing for some level of basic civil rights within Ottoman society. In 1894-96, the Turkish government at that time was a monarchy that was run by a person called the Sultan, or labeled as the Sultan, became very decided that these groups had gone too much, and particularly the Armenians, who had been sort of bringing in some European ideas about democracy, about basic human rights and security and so forth, decided they had pushed too much in asking to be treated, with these rights. And there was a backlash attack against Armenians, somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000, because the record keeping was so bad in the Ottoman Empire, it's hard to know exactly what the numbers were, of Armenians out of a population of a little over 2 million Armenians were actually killed in this period. And this set a tone in the Ottoman Empire for minority groups. It was a strong message that there was real danger in advocating for rights. At the same time, this also was part in the Ottoman Empire of an awareness by some Turkish people and others who were Muslims, who had rights under the system, that their system was a problem. And so what ended up happening was there was actually a revolutionary movement from the late 1800s up until 1908 that under which Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Jews, Assyrians, and Greeks joined together in a revolutionary movement that actually overthrew that old sultanic, monarchical government and imposed for the first time a genuine constitution that, at least on paper, looked really good. There was an opportunity for what we would call equal rights. There was a recognition of freedom of religion for the first time, so that being a Christian, being a Jew did not mean that you couldn't have full rights within the society. And there was a moment of real hope. There are stories of Armenians and Turks and Kurds and Jews and everyone embracing in the streets and just so excited about this possibility. Unfortunately, the Turkish sort of people and Turkish political activists were the vast majority, just by population size. Were really 3/4 or 2/3 of this movement, something like that. And within that leadership, within the activist movement among the Turks, there emerged a real split. And this will connect a lot to what Dr. Stevrick had talked about before. There was a split between people who thought that the future of the Ottoman Empire was in embracing multiculturalism, embracing democracy, embracing liberalism, and moving forward as a European and Asian modern country, if I can say it that way. Similar to what we had seen in evolution in certain other societies in Europe, in the Americas, and so forth. There was another wing that had decided, and some people would argue they had already thought that, and they sort of used the revolution as a means to get to power, had already decided that any future of the Ottoman Empire had to be Turkish dominated. And their view was quite the opposite. What they believed is that the Ottoman Empire should become perfectly Turkish. And this is very similar to some elements of Nazi ideology, Hutu extremist ideology, and many other cases. You can even see this in with the Khmer Rouge ideology. They had a very specific view of who should be part of this new Ottoman Turkey. And that view was based on Turkish identity. You had to be Muslim, Turkish speaking, and Turkish identified, and that's a little amorphous, but you had to be very clearly Turkish and only Turkish. So you had this idea of Turkism that was the goal of this more extreme group of Turkish activists, so-called Young Turks. And they slowly, from about 1909, when there was actually a massacre of Armenians that was a little bit of a warning that people didn't pay enough attention to, 1909 to 1914, this extremist group consolidated power. And part of the way they did that is they set up a kind of secondary network, an unofficial government that was underneath the official government of the Ottoman Empire, by which they really controlled the Ottoman Empire according to this ideology and according to this network that was Turkish only. And when World War I started, they saw this as an opportunity to eliminate all of the opposition. And they believed, for instance, Kurds who were Muslims could be forcibly assimilated to Turkish identity. So they were sort of pulled into this project. But they were very clear that Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians could not be assimilated. Their culture was too strong, their religious identity, and again, it's very much a cultural religious identity, not merely a matter of professing faith, that couldn't change. And so they laid the groundwork. Greeks were really the first group to be targeted early on. There was some sense in which Greeks could be expelled to Greece, but that also involved, there was a tremendous amount of killing of Greeks as well. And by 1915, a full-fledged genocide was underway. The Ottoman Empire, the Young Turk extremists had decided there was no other option, and they used the cover of the war to begin mass killing and some other features that we'll get to in one moment if I have maybe one more minute. They began mass extermination of these subject populations. Should be noted that Jews in the Ottoman Empire were a very small group. And so they were not outright targeted with the same kind of ideological commitment. But some scholars of this period have certainly found evidence of targeting of Jews as well. So it's good to keep that in mind. They were not big enough as a minority group to warrant special attention by the Young Turks. Armenians, out of a population of 20 million, Armenians were about 2.5 million. Greeks were well over 2 million. Assyrians were probably 750,000. So they were almost, they were a significant chunk of this empire. The process that emerged, and we can talk about that, but the process that emerged was very similar in all of the cases. It involved killing elites, spiritual leaders, political leaders, literary figures, and so forth, to kind of so-called cut off the head of each of those communities so that they were not able to organize any kind of resistance. The next step, or a parallel step, was targeting military-age men and boys. And it should be noted that Assyrians, Greeks, and Armenians were serving very loyally in the Ottoman Empire, and were actually disarmed and turned into first these sort of slave labor battalions and in many cases worked to death, and where they weren't, they were then executed in 1914, 1915. And then you had these three populations, which were largely elderly people, women, and I don't mean to sound sexist here, but women who had been socialized very much against being able to commit violence, being sites of resistance, taking up arms and so forth, and children. And the Ottoman government had this incredibly well-organized system of deporting village after village, town after town, region after region, these populations from this area, forcing them onto these long marches where they would intentionally walk them around desert areas without food, without water, in incredibly harsh weather conditions, super cold at night, burning 100 degrees during the day. They were preyed upon by both Kurdish groups recruited for this purpose, local Turks, and special organizations. You can think of them a little bit like the Einsatzgruppen, but these were groups of killing squads that were actually typically criminals, rapists, murderers, and others who were released from Ottoman prisons, specifically to be formed into units that could attack Armenians and these other groups. And through this process of killing, of mass rape, of these forced marches, a huge percentage of these groups died. Those who survived were thrown into the middle of the desert in today's Syria, and many more were massacred or forced basically to starve to death, and so on. So I hope that's a good sort of introduction to give you an idea of what happened in this period. There was also a second phase of the genocide that targeted each of the groups in 1919 to 1923, when survivors tried to return, and in places that have been relatively left alone. Greek-dominated Smyrna, for instance, were targeted by the new Turkish Republic and new nationalist movement because they still had that idea of Turkish identity as being the only legitimate identity within Turkey. And so even there were tens of thousands and actually hundreds of thousands of these groups killed, many of whom were trying to return to their homes after they thought World War I was over, we're safe, the Young Turks are gone, and unfortunately that was not the case at all. So let me stop there, and we can pick up anything that is of interest.
I'd like to ask another question. The perpetrators of the Armenian genocide, were they brought to justice?
It's a very complicated question. There were a limited number of trials in 1919 of some perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. The main perpetrators, Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Jamal Pasha, were not tried. Enver and Talat very notably escaped to Russia and to Germany, respectively, at the end of the war, and were harbored in different places. And both were eventually killed. Actually, Talat Pasha was hunted down by an Armenian who was, obviously traumatized by the genocide and was gunned down in Berlin. There was a famous trial in which he was acquitted because of the facts of the genocide. Some people were brought to justice. There were some executions, some jail sentences, but what happened very quickly was that trial process faded out. There was this new Turkish nationalist movement, and they started integrating genocide perpetrators into that movement very fully and inviting them in to build the new Turkey. A lot of those who were jailed were let out of prison. Britain made a deal. They had hundreds of perpetrators actually in Malta at one point, and they made a deal to give them back to Turkey, not to stand trial in exchange for British POWs, and so on. And since that point in time, those 1919 trials, there really has been no accountability in any way for the perpetrators or through a reparative process.
Describe some of the ways that Turkey and the international community have denied the Armenian genocide and what the effects of that denial has been.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'll try to be really brief on this. There are so many different methods that are used, strategies that are used, players that are involved, and arguments. And what I would say is one thing for anybody who's familiar with some of the arguments that have been used to deny racism in the United States, deny genocide against Native Americans, treatment of African Americans, and so forth. Anybody who's familiar with some of the arguments that are used to deny violence against women, rape in the United States every day, so forth, who are familiar with Holocaust denial arguments, Rwandan genocide denial arguments, and so forth, really you see the same kinds of arguments used again and again. It's the fault of the victim. It was a mutual conflict. It was a civil war is my favorite. And you even see this in the Holocaust denial, where there's a claim made that the world Jewry had declared war on Germany or on Aryans, these kind of absurd claims. And more subtle things, playing games with statistics, numbers. There were 2.5 million Armenians by 1915 in the Ottoman Empire, and 1.5 million of those disappeared, during the period. That's pretty strong evidence for a process of mass killing. But demographers will reduce that number and say, well, actually, they're only about like 1.6 million, and then they'll inflate the numbers of survivors and so forth. You see the same thing. David Irving is famous for this in Holocaust denial. You see this in all these different cases. So there are all sorts of techniques that are used. And, in the case of Turkey, which is a little bit different from the Holocaust, although you could say that certain states today, Iran might be an example, do officially support Holocaust denial. But Turkey, really since the 1920s and 30s, has had a campaign of denial. It's used tremendous diplomatic resources. In more recent years, over the past few decades, it spent millions and tens of millions of dollars just in the United States on public relations firms, buying academic positions and so forth to advance its denial. And so that's just sort of a quick picture of denial. And that really has included stopping movies from being made in Hollywood about the Armenian Genocide, stopping, attacking genocide curriculum bills that promote teaching the Holocaust, the Armenian Genocide, and other cases, transatlantic slave trade, and so forth. And really the sustained campaign to just stop discussion where that's not possible, to just raise all sorts of, false claims meant to sort of undermine the truth. So I can stop there. I mean, there's more to talk about, but I think that's a basic idea. And it's really very prominent in the United States. There are professors who have positions in the United States because they are Armenian genocide deniers. And there are indirect funding from the Turkish government. University of Utah Press, actually run by a Turkish denier. No, I'm sorry, not the press. A Turkish denier runs a Turkish studies series of books in the University of Utah Press, and has had carte blanche. They've just been publishing denialist stuff where many other university presses now refuse to do that. They found a sort of haven. They've pumped a lot of money into it and have been able to do that. So.
Jermaine, would you like to speak to, you've looked at multiple types of human rights abuses, genocide in various parts of the world. But I think both you and Henry have both spoken to the Native American case. Could you speak to maybe similarities or differences of denial amongst of the Native American case of genocide and that of Armenian and maybe Holocaust as well?
Right. I think it's important to note what exactly is denial. So beyond it being the continuation of genocide, I think a way I look at denial is that denial is really a condemnation to non-existence. Because denial is not just that it didn't happen, it means that you don't exist, right? Because denial is really that kind of condemnation. As Aisha Gunasi says, that those who are killed twice. First by the extermination, and second by the denial of truth, right? we may say, well, look, there's enough evidence to confirm these genocides, but it's far more important than that. It's far more consequential. Denial comes from an unwillingness to humanize others, right? Because you deny their existence, you deny their memory, you deny their equality and their humanity. To think of it another way, when you think of the Armenian genocide and denial, it comes from a perspective that, look, knowledge is created as a result of power. How we remember and how we forget is really a feature of power, right? Those who have history on their sides, you know, we love to say the pen is mightier than the sword. But let's look at the Native American peoples, because it wasn't a single genocide. There were several nations of Native Americans or First Peoples. What happens is this very surreptitious, almost innocent idea of cultural assimilation. The Indian Reservation School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, perhaps maybe the most famous, the motto was to kill the Indian and save the man, right? This is the kind of logic, to kill the Indian but save the man. This idea that we're going to do cultural erasure. So even if we can't deny that they exist, we're going to erase who they are. We see that with the First Peoples in Canada, cultural genocide. We see that with the cultural assimilation of First Peoples in the United States. We see that even with the way in which the gravity and extremity of transatlantic trade in Africans is often dismissed, is often thought of as so long in history. Let us move on from it. In the case of Turkey and the Armenian genocide, it is like, okay, people died on both sides, so it was really a war, right? And then with the Jewish Holocaust, it is that let us not inflate these numbers, right? Many of these persons died as a result of the harsh conditions of war. All of that is based on this idea of an unwillingness to see the role of power in shaping ideas, right? How do we come to education? The reason why we're having this forum, and thank you, Hudson County, for doing this. The reason why we're having this forum is about education. But education isn't just based on knowledge transfer. It is based on an idea of transferring advocacy, right? For me, education is not just knowledge transfer, but it's advocacy. Martin Luther King Jr. said it best. He says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So if we are going to talk about advocacy, we can't just simply advocate for the very esoteric notions of injustice. If you are advocating for proper memorialing of the Jewish Holocaust, of the Armenian Genocide, we also equally have to advocate for the extermination and the cultural assimilation of native peoples, and also the historical extermination through enslavement of Africans. And so denial is consequential primarily because it helps to organize amnesia, right? Selective amnesia. We are selective in our memory primarily because of how education does. And I know you may not have gotten there, but this is part of the assault on critical race theory. This idea that to memorialize the truth of the transatlantic trade in Africans and its consequence is somehow divisive, right? That history is divisive, and so we should selectively forget aspects of history. You know, I tell my students in my African history class all the time is that when we talk about history, history is not a neutral exercise. History is written from the perspective of those who are the victors. And so we can't think of history as a neutral production of facts. It is really based from the perspective of power. And that is why denial is the continuation of genocide. So for every person that denies the Armenian genocide, it is the continuation of victimization. For every person that denies the Jewish Holocaust, it is the continuation of the pogroms. For every person that denies the Native American genocides and the African American, the killing of Africans leaving Africa, they are continuing to deny the existence of these people. And that is how I understand denial.
Doyle, I know that within the context of Holocaust denial, that there's different levels. The way denial is expressed in the U.S. is somewhat different than how it may be expressed in Poland or Hungary. Would you like to maybe talk about contemporary Holocaust denial in context, especially within Eastern and parts of Central Europe, and on the rise, across Europe and the U.S. as well?
Thank you. Absolutely. This is part of what got me into this work, because the piece of my own journey I didn't talk about was how my student and my neighbor were able to go to high-performing public high schools and then state universities with their racist views intact. And I wondered, how is it possible that you can be educated and believe these things? And because these two people matched me identically on paper, right? I could have met the description that they had of them. These weren't my stereotypes of racists who were, Nazi skinheads or rural Klan members. That taught me that there was nothing in our school system that would challenge racist ideologies. And I wondered how that could be. And of course, when we had the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, we didn't have a movement to create the cultural change that could allow us to fulfill its potential. So I wanted to understand what that would look like. And the closest transformation I could find was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And to me, the effort to fulfill that transformation was the civic education programs. They were trying to create democratic citizens on the heels of an authoritarian state. But when I landed in Estonia, and my flight was scheduled for September 14th, 2001, the geopolitics of the region had shifted. All they wanted was security from Russia, right? They knew the threat Russia posed, and they're saying today, why didn't you listen to us, right? But in September 14th, 2001, the United States was saying Russia is the key ally in the war on terror. You need to buddy up to them, and you need to accept our understanding of history. Now, if you were in Estonia in 1939, your experience of history looked like this. The Soviets invaded and took over your country and incorporated into the Soviet Union. The Nazis drove them out for 3 years, and then the Soviets came back and stayed for 50. Well, the result of that was many people saw the Soviets as liberators, and any historic anti-Semitism stuck around because they didn't deal with the history of the Holocaust. Survivors weren't free to publish their experiences, and they weren't free to learn about the history that was being understood and developed in the West. So you get into the 1990s, and I went to this country. These were people I liked and respected, and then I discovered what their understanding of history was. It was diametrically opposed to my own, and I had to make sense of that, right? So there were reasonably intelligent people writing books denying the Holocaust. That was possible because of the devastation of the Soviet regime and the intellectual impact of that. And it took decades for them to start to wrap their minds around the reality of history and come to grips with what really happened. Helping people face the reality of history, that's a journey and a challenge. And so, as I think you were getting at, denial has a variety of flavors. I mean, there are students who hear the reality of what happened and they can't believe it, right? Disbelief. That kind of skepticism is almost a natural thing. And in fact, that happened in many Jewish communities who couldn't believe that the Germans were capable of what they were being told. We have to differentiate that kind of skepticism, which can be overcome with evidence, from the ideological, committed Holocaust deniers. These are the extremists, the ideological extremists. And I'm not certain how we can help to deprogram these racist extremists. That's where a lot of the denial is coming from. I think our best tool is to build a culture of evidence. And by that, I mean just being able to ask, what's the evidence? How do we know? Because we're going to keep encountering this racist ideology on the web, other kinds of ideologies on the internet. It's out there, the same garbage. And until our students are able to ask the question, well, is it true? and know how to determine that by saying what's the evidence, we're going to have a hard time dealing with that. So I think one of our top goals has to be not just telling students the truth, because then it's just competing truths. We have to get them to ask habitually, how do we know? And that's building a culture of evidence. So thank you for the question.
It's excellent. That's excellent. And I would like to, I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to questions from the audience. For those participating, please feel free to add questions into the Q&A and for our panelists. My last question, which in some ways, Doyle, I know you may have already kind of addressed your perspective on, but just to kind of leave us on maybe a positive note, I'd love for each panelist to give me their perspective on genocide prevention matters that could be taken to make the world a more ethical and humane place. Would you like to start, Doyle?
Certainly. So this is a long-term, lifelong project, right? It's all about never again and how do we get to never again. But stopping genocide is a huge undertaking. And we have to start with the spoken word, and we have to start with our young people so that they're in position to build the kind of world where every Anne Frank has the opportunity to fulfill her potential and live her natural life. For us, my personal mindset had to shift. I was worried about how do you deal with individual minds and changing the mindset of people who might be susceptible to racism. Well, all of us as human beings are susceptible to these kinds of forces. But what I learned is that in the Holocaust, we celebrate the helpers and the upstanders, the people who risked their lives to make a difference. There simply were not enough of them, and there never will be. We can never rely on heroic individuals alone to be the difference. We need to create communities of upstanders. And that's why in our approach, we really try to build a cohort of people who appreciate that we need to stand up together, that if you have my back and I have yours, and we're committed to standing up together, that we will and we won't be swimming upstream anymore. We will be the stream. And if we can form that moral consensus to be a community of upstanders, our next step is to put students in position to act on that. And acting on that starts locally, right? None of us feel that we can change the presidential election or end world hunger, but we can provide meals and we can have conversations with people. We can build our civic self-efficacy locally in our classrooms and in our communities. And when we learn that we can make a difference working together, that's when our civic capacity grows. That's when we build that potential to intervene, to help people learn to care about places that are far away, people they can't immediately relate to, and begin to take those steps. So that's where we start our efforts, trying to build communities of upstanders. And thank you for the question.
Dr. Stevrick, if I can interject just for 1 second, you mentioned places that are far away. If you could move your camera and show us what you showed us earlier and tell us exactly.
Okay, thank you for that cue. So I am in Amsterdam and I'm in the back garden of the Anne Frank house itself. So let me turn to you here. We have these beautiful flowers, and right behind me, there's 4 buildings. One of the one is where Anne Frank and the other 3 members of her family, together with 4 other people, lived in hiding for more than 2 years. And it was right here. Nobody around could know and act on that. But it took a whole network, a whole community of people to keep them alive for 2 years. And although it was an astonishing achievement to keep them alive for 2 years, it was difficult to celebrate when they lost almost everyone in hiding. So it's an ongoing struggle, and thank you for that invitation.
Thank you, Doyle. Jermaine, what are your thoughts on how we can better look at prevention, like what types of prevention methods we could potentially employ?
Right. So the how starts with the what is, right? So we, Doyle just made reference to the kind of clarion call that has resulted in not less but more genocide. So the Argentinian Truth Commission report of 1986 was called Nunca Más, never again. And yet still we continued to see an international community that was complicit, certainly in looking the other way or in calling it something else. And so I think genocide education must first be justice-centered, right? Not just focusing on, okay, as Doyle was rightfully saying, not just situating where genocides have occurred, but to teach this idea that when we talk about what do people deserve, what does it mean to be human? It starts with teaching tolerance and mutual respect, right? That you don't have to have all the information to respect someone. Tolerance is not just to tolerate, but tolerance is quite akin to this idea of the South African and Swahili concept called Ubuntu. I am because we are. When translated in its most literal, it literally means people are people only through other people. And that's important. If you're going to do genocide education, it has to start from a humanistic understanding of justice. I am because we are, right? There is one race, the human race. And so if we're going to talk about tolerance and respect, we have to focus on this. The practical tools that are required is geography. Doyle again, I love the setup behind him with the maps, right? The map of the world. The cartography is important. We sometimes take for granted what people know and where they know things from, right? And so I think it's important to give our students a sense of the world, that the world is not North America. The world is not the Americas, right? The world has far-flung places that are 9, 10,000, 12,000, 13,000 miles away, right? To help them situate an understanding that I am a child of the universe, no more, no less, right? That we are all children of the universe. The final thing to do is to ensure, and again, I like what Doyle says, it's not just teaching them the truth. From the South African Truth Commission, they came up with 5 different types of truths. And I'll just quickly say them so we understand how truth is problematic. It's the official truth, what was written in the Truth Commission report. There was forensic truth, what was from evidence. There was historic or dialogic truth. There was truth as narrative in terms of stories. And then there was restorative or healing truth. The question really becomes, what kind of truth do we want to teach our children and to teach our society? And I think it's important that we teach restorative truth. Truth that restores both the dignity of the survivors and victims, but also humanizes societies that have committed genocide. Thank you.
Hank, you could take this from the more individual level, this question from the more individual level, like of genocide education, or different efforts on community-based or even macro-based ideas that you may have in terms of.
No, certainly education, and I think towards a willingness. And I think both of the other speakers have done a better job than I can in saying this, but really toward being willing to face the reality of your own society, your own identity. I'm saying as a white guy in the U.S., right? To be able to really take seriously that if you want the world to be a decent place, you've got to work at it, because we're surrounded by violence. It's done in our name. It's done by us, and so forth. And I think what both panels are saying is we need a process of really being serious about seeing reality as it is and being willing to do something meaningful to change it. When we talk about upstanders, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about people who, it's not easy to do that. You have to push yourself to do it. It's uncomfortable. You face consequences. So I think that's one point. And I think genocide education, even the kinds of bills, there's recent funding that's gone through for Holocaust education in the US, pushing for the same thing for Assyrian, Greek, and Armenian genocide. these are important because it gives people this basic knowledge. We're hearing about that, coupled with critical thinking, which I think is really important. Deniers don't win by falsifying evidence. They win by manipulating our sense of critical thinking and getting us, even using what looks like critical thinking to get us to think, oh, what about the other side of the story of the Holocaust? Why do you just believe what is written in your textbook? Why aren't you critical? That's a misuse of critical thinking. So I think all of that is really important at that sort of base level as a deep transformation of society. And I think linked to that, honestly, is stopping long-range liberalism, if I can use my dissertation director's term. We are all horrified by what's happening in Ukraine, right? I mean, and there's no doubt that the suffering is horrible and we want it to stop, and we should be making an effort to stop it. But why isn't the same effort, the same outrage, the same front page story every day about domestic violence in the US, about African Americans being killed in the street, and so forth? And while we've gotten better in recent years about that, we still, I think we tend to use what's happening somewhere else that doesn't implicate us, where we can be the good guys, as a way of avoiding, what are we doing about Native Americans? We're building horribly environmentally destroying things across the places where they get their water, and things like that. No wonder the life expectancy of Native Americans is decades lower on reservations than the general population in the US, things like that. I think there's also a very practical solution, and without getting into the details, I'll reference Congressman Jim McGovern, who is the congressman from Worcester area. And for those who know me, I'm not one to give praise to elected officials very easily. But he and some colleagues in Congress, two other colleagues in Congress in 1998-99, really came up with, I think, the most effective genocide prevention strategy. For those who know, in 1975 and on, in East Timor, the Indonesian government and its sort of paramilitary proxies killed about 250,000 out of 700,000 East Timorese. Ultimately, the goal was getting control of the oil fields off the coast of this part of the world and so forth, as we all know happens all the time. And things, continued even into the 1990s. But through UN interventions and other things, there was an effort to get a self-determination vote in East Timor in 1999 that would allow them to finally have full independence. We won't get into the colonial history; it's all very complicated. And to basically get a future guarantee of security against Indonesia. Indonesia started the genocide again, killed thousands of people. And Congressman McGovern and two other congressional leaders went to East Timor and said, what do you need us to do? What do you want us to do? And the answer, as he says it, was call off your dogs. What did he mean? The weapons that were being used in East Timor were supplied by the United States, Australia, and Great Britain. The political support in the UN was from Australia, Great Britain, and the US. The foreign aid had propped up the Indonesian government. And they said, if you stop giving the support, the genocide will stop. And these congressional leaders convinced the Clinton administration to do that. They withdrew the military support. They withdrew the political support, and the genocide stopped. And I think we have to remember, it doesn't necessarily, military intervention is not always the way to go, and other things. Sometimes just taking the guns away, taking the power, the political power away from perpetrators is what you need to stop genocide. And it's a great way to save lives, not increasing and not to increase and destabilize a region, which too often military intervention does. So I'll stop there, but for a thought that there have been successful genocide prevention interventions, and that's probably the most successful that I know of.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you so much. World we live in, Doyle had to sign off early because Anne Frank House closes down with pretty significant alarm systems, and so he had to he had to get out of the building so before he was in for the night.
Sarah, for what it's worth, could you comment on what that tells us about anti-Semitism and the sort of violence that's always on the edge? I mean, in terms of security in synagogues and so forth, I'm assuming the Anne Frank security measures are because of the real risk that folks associated working there and so forth are under.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that and for the audience, I have a bit of a background. I'm Jewish and Armenian, so I got a foot in two genocides, so to speak. And yeah, absolutely that because of rise of fascism and anti-Semitism in Europe and the U.S. internationally, that and for a lot of parts that has always been the case that the amount of security is continues to increase. I'd also like to say that, and Hank, I really appreciate your comments on that. That as a woman who lives in the United States, I've always had to be concerned with time of night and where I am, and knowing that violence, against women can include violence against me at any point in time, and so it does become unfortunate that so many of us, regardless of religion or ethnicity or gender, regularly consider one's own personal safety or the safety of our people in daily life. So, but I really wanted to end this on a bit more positive note. And Hank had done such a good job with looking at interventions that work. And I was reminded of that this week in Armenia. That I think I've become a bit cynical, and I found that. And in Armenia, there is a real threat and some would say ongoing genocide occurring, with attacks by Azerbaijan, supported by Turkey, on borders of proper Armenia, and the loss of territories and ethnic area of Armenia, ethnic Armenian area called Artsakh, and but that there are historical, we can look at history not only to learn where we failed, but where we've succeeded, and that we don't always have to look, we can look at what the West has done, but also within a non-Western context. There are examples of times in which smaller countries have been able to figure out how to fend off human rights atrocities, and of course it helps when not funded by larger superpowers, and so even within the context when we look at individuals, and as upstanders, we can also look at larger groups and countries and positive works that have been done, and try our best to model them. So. Yes. Would Jermaine, just to kind of wrap up, would you like to kind of send us off with any last thoughts?
I think from Ted Carpertian,
Okay.
he had a very interesting question that I know is also the title of a conversation and a book of recent vintage about how do we teach difference without hierarchy. It's important that the intervening variable is shared power, right? And so we can talk about difference, right? Because we can talk about the construction, the social construction of difference. But how do we do that, without hierarchical and stratification? I think that is a very important question. How I would respond to it is when we think of the ways in which reportage happens about genocides, about killings, we know that there's a hierarchy of importance, right? And so the media portrays, right, what the media seeks to portray. And I think part of the way in which we can remove differentiation without hierarchy is to understand this common wheel of humanity, right? We don't get to difference without hierarchy simply because politicians say that we're all people when they want to strategically clamor for or support. I think of the Armenian Genocide, and I think of the fact that, as Henry was talking about, multiculturalism should not just be an article of faith, it should be a practice, right? And I think that is part of the ways in which Canada is a little farther along than the US is, right? In this idea that multiculturalism is not just a statement of faith, but it is actually a practice. And I think that is how we have to understand acknowledging and accepting difference without hierarchical configurations.
Well put. There's a question for you, Dr. Theriot. Can you address how Turkey's support for Azerbaijan and Erdogan's pronouncement about finishing the project of their forefathers continues to play out in the imminent genocidal threat against the indigenous population of Artsakh today?
Oh, sure. No, thank you for that question. I saw it come up in the Q&A. Very simply, Armenia and Armenians are in the way of Turkey still. Turkey never went through the kind of reparative, rehabilitative process that Jermaine has written so well about in so many different contexts, from the Caribbean to other places, including Turkey. And so the attitudes of genocide really just are there. They're in the military institutions, they're in the culture, they're in the educational system. And similarly with Azerbaijan, there's this historical issue with Armenia and Azerbaijan essentially trying to force out Armenians out of a particular area that Armenians have been in for probably 1,000 years, that had been given by Stalin to the Azeri SSR during the Soviet years to promote instability among ethnic groups, essentially, without getting into the details. And to make a long story short, in 2020, Azerbaijan and Turkey attacked the Armenians in that historical enclave, and wreaked havoc. Again, it's 90 million people against 3, including all of the Republic of Armenia, the best of weapons, oil money, everything. It was a devastating war. Thousands of Armenians were killed. And in a very short time, Azerbaijan took most of that area, and also invaded Armenia, the Armenian Republic as well. And they continue to occupy part of Armenia and have been expanding, especially in the southern area. You just need to look at a little bit of the news coverage, and you will see the statements by Aliyev, who is the leader of Azerbaijan, Erdogan, and other leaders in Turkey, and they make very clear that they are taking up the unfinished business of the 1915 genocide because Armenians are again a problem, and they haven't gone away. They were supposed to go away. They haven't gone away. They now have a country in this area since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And the campaign is explicitly and intentionally eliminationist. They want ultimately Armenians gone. They want the Armenian Republic gone. And they have been using, some horrific means, including importing thousands of jihadi mercenaries from Libya and Syria to sort of join in this attack over the last couple of years. So I would say that, if you don't deal with genocide, as Jermaine has again, really talked about so eloquently in so many of his works, if you don't deal with the past, it's the present, and it comes back, and we can see that in violence against African Americans today. We can see it in treatment of Native Americans. We haven't dealt with the past, and it means that past is part of the present. So in a nutshell, that's it. Of course, I encourage people to read newspaper articles and so forth if they're interested in the topic. I would add there was a great question about femicide in Mexico. And I did want to say that one of the big criticisms of the UN Genocide Convention is it does not include gender or sexuality in the targeted groups that are protected. And this is something that even the UN internal reporting and discussion has challenged. Sarah pointed out gender issues even, in the United States and in other places. And so I would argue with my sense of genocide that the sustained targeting of thousands of women, and you can see a similar thing happening with Indigenous women in Western Canada over the last 30 years with hundreds of murders that you know the police essentially allowed to happen, and so forth. I think this is genocidal. It's eliminationist. It's typically using gender, and in the case of Mexico, class, and probably ethnicity at some level, depending on you know the complexities of indigenous identity in Mexico, to create a group who are considered expendable, rapeable, killable, and so forth. And I think that is genocidal. Jermaine might have other things to say on that, but that might be helpful.
You know, just quickly, I echo everything Henry says, because when we talk about the intent to kill in part or in whole, it also has to be followed up not with just national or religious or cultural groups, but also gender, right? And that we can talk about GBV, gender-based violence, but we're not talking at the ground zero level, that ultimately it is the complicity of a power structure that is androcentric that gives kind of justification. You know, when women are raped, they deserve it. It's something they did. You know, when they are killed, it's because they did something. And sometimes the only doing is being a woman, being female, right? And so I think, as Henry says, it's important that we understand that we also have to agitate for some of this kind of legislative and you know, human rights you know, change, because if 51.3% of the world are women, right, but those who control the power structure are disproportionately and overwhelmingly men, even when women are in power, right? Because we have nominal power and we have authoritative power. And I think that is part of the reason why gender-based violence, and especially what is happening in gender-based killings in Mexico and across the Americas, is almost sanitized as the unfortunate, you know, overwhelming, under-resourced nature of police forces, and not about the complicity of power.
That's really tremendous, and way to kind of wrap things up. And I just want to kind of end. There was a comment from an audience member that was really excellent. That just a reminder that New Jersey has actually done a really incredible job in terms of mandating genocide and human rights education work. New Jersey has been one of the strongest states, along with California, to ensure that multiple genocides and human rights issues have been taught in the state for over, I think we're getting on to 40 years now, and continuing to update and look at and bring in teacher trainings and resources for educators. And it's really thank you so much. For Hudson College, Community College, to bring us together today, and thank you, panelists, for giving us your time and knowledge on this very important day of Yom HaShoah. And so thank you all for being here tonight and this afternoon. I'm so sorry, I'm on Yerevan time, and I hope that our audience has you know, something to think about on, again, this very special day. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists and to our moderator and to all of you for joining today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you all, and our audience especially.